April 2001, outside Double Springs, Alabama, Loretta Byrd wasn't supposed to be out in the back pasture before sunrise. For 3 mornings in a row, the same 6 goats had slipped through a loose section of fencing and walked straight toward the same stretch of kudzu. They ignored the hay she'd carefully laid out for them, ignored the open pasture behind them, and ignored every call she made. They weren't running from anything, and they certainly weren't lost. Every morning they returned to exactly the same place, lingering at the edge of the vines as though something beyond that tangled green wall kept drawing them back. On the 4th morning, curiosity finally got the better of her. Instead of turning the goats around, Loretta followed them. She pushed through the thick wall of kudzu, forcing her way into ground she hadn't stepped on in more than 20 years. The vines pulled at her boots and caught her sleeves as she worked deeper into the ravine until one final step brought her to an abrupt stop. It wasn't the goats that stopped her. It was what they had led her to. As you watch, pay close attention to the place these goats keep returning to, because hidden beyond those vines is not only the answer to Loretta's impossible deadline, but also a discovery nobody on that land had made in decades. 2 weeks earlier, Loretta Byrd had exactly $41 left in her purse and a certified county letter sitting unopened in the glove box of her aging pickup truck. She already knew what it said before breaking the seal. The county had given her 45 days to prove she was bringing the kudzu spreading across the back of the 50 acres she had inherited from her father under control. If she failed, officials would hire a professional removal crew, complete the work themselves, and place a lien on the property for the full cost, an amount that could easily exceed $25,000. For Loretta, it wasn't simply another bill. It was the kind of debt she had no realistic way of paying. The property had belonged to her family for as long as she could remember. As a little girl, she had followed her father across nearly every acre, helping mend fences, check cattle, and cut firewood. But there was always one place he promised they would get to next season. A steep ravine at the back of the farm had slowly disappeared beneath a growing wall of kudzu, and every year another job seemed more urgent than tackling vines that looked impossible to beat. After her father passed away 3 years earlier, Loretta inherited not only the land he loved, but also the unfinished burden he never had the chance to solve. The county's notice hadn't arrived because the vines had suddenly become more aggressive. They had finally reached the neighboring fence line, climbing over the posts and spreading onto the adjoining property until a complaint was filed under the county's invasive species ordinance. That complaint transformed a problem her father had postponed for years into a deadline measured in days. And as Loretta folded the letter back into its envelope, she found herself remembering something he used to tell her whenever a job seemed too big for one person. Land usually tells you how to save it. Most folks just stop watching too soon. She wanted to believe he was right, but belief didn't pay contractors, and it certainly didn't clear 50 acres of kudzu. The feed store where she worked had reduced her hours for the 2nd time that spring, leaving her with barely enough money to cover groceries and fuel. Hiring a removal crew wasn't an option, so the only thing left to do was search for some opportunity she could still afford. That search led her to a small livestock auction just outside Double Springs, where she hoped, more than expected, to find something that might help her earn enough money to keep both herself and her father's land afloat. Loretta hadn't driven to the auction looking for goats to clear kudzu. She'd gone because the feed store had cut her hours again, and with only $41 left, she needed any opportunity she could still afford. When Lot 14 entered the ring, the auctioneer barely slowed down. 60 starving goats crowded into 2 battered trailers, their ribs showing beneath dull coats, were worth so little that he opened the bidding at $10 just to move them along. Nobody offered a bid. After a long pause, Loretta quietly raised her hand. 11. The hammer fell almost immediately. 60 unwanted goats were hers for less than the cost of a single bag of feed, and as she signed the paperwork, she couldn't decide whether she'd just bought herself a future or 60 new problems. Delbert Cagle, a goat farmer who had raised livestock in the county for more than 30 years, watched her load the herd before slowly shaking his head. "Loretta," he said, "some of those goats won't survive the month, and the rest won't earn you anything for a long while. You didn't buy a herd today. You bought a headache." His words lingered long after she drove away, raising a question she couldn't answer. Had she just spent the last of her money on animals that couldn't even be saved? The following morning, veterinarian Dr. Renee Okafor confirmed the herd was in rough condition. Heavy parasite loads, mineral deficiencies, and severe malnutrition had left several goats fighting for their lives, although she believed most could recover with proper care. Recovery, however, would take weeks, and weeks were exactly what Loretta no longer had. The county officer offered even less encouragement. After reviewing her file, he reminded her that the ordinance required visible proof that the kudzu itself was being controlled. Owning livestock changed nothing unless she could demonstrate they were actually reducing the infestation, and the 45-day deadline remained firmly in place. The hardest conversation came at home. After reading the county notice, her sister Marlene looked from the letter to the exhausted herd outside and asked the question everyone else was thinking. "You spent our last money on 60 starving goats." Loretta wanted to explain herself. She couldn't. Not because she regretted buying them, but because she honestly didn't know what those goats were about to become. If you've ever made a decision everyone else believed was foolish because it was the only chance you had left, then you already know how Loretta felt. Stay with this story, because what happens next changes far more than anyone expected. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Only one person reacted differently. Late that afternoon, Cecil Whitmire stopped beside the fence, watched the herd for a few quiet moments, then glanced toward the thick wall of kudzu covering the back of the property. "Don't spend money feeding what's already growing." That was all he said before driving away. Loretta watched his truck disappear down the road, turning those words over in her mind, completely unaware that the answer to every problem she faced was already growing along the very fence where she was about to pen the herd. With almost no money left, Loretta built a temporary paddock along the only stretch of ground she could fence quickly, the dense wall of kudzu covering the back of the property. She wasn't trying to clear the vines. She simply needed somewhere to keep 60 recovering goats alive while she figured out what to do next. Every morning began before sunrise. She checked the weakest animals first, treated parasites and mineral deficiencies, repaired whatever sections of temporary fencing the goats had tested overnight, rationed the little hay she could still afford, then left for her shortened shift at the feed store before returning home to care for the herd until dark. The work was exhausting, but every small improvement reminded her of something her father used to say whenever a difficult job seemed impossible: land rewarded patience far more often than force. By the end of the first week, most of the herd had begun eating consistently. Only a handful remained critically weak, and the first section of fence line looked noticeably thinner than it had the day she built the pen. Loretta assumed the goats were simply browsing whatever happened to be growing nearby. She still hadn't realized they were choosing one plant over everything else. Not every day brought good news. Despite Dr. Okafor's efforts, 2 goats died during the first week, and another came dangerously close before finally recovering. Standing beside the pen that evening, Loretta couldn't help wondering if Delbert had been right all along, and whether she had spent her last $11 trying to save animals that were never going to save themselves. A few mornings later, however, she noticed something she couldn't explain. Instead of walking toward the hay, the goats headed straight for the thick kudzu vines climbing the fence. One after another they pulled the vines to the ground and ate them eagerly, barely touching anything else until the leaves were gone. Curious, Loretta stopped trying to guide them and simply watched over the next several days. The more she observed, the harder it became to ignore what was happening. The goats feeding most heavily on the kudzu were recovering faster, putting on weight more quickly, and showing more energy than the animals she had briefly separated onto thinner pasture. For the first time, she found herself asking a question that had never crossed her mind before. What if the very plant threatening to cost her the farm was also the thing helping save her herd? Around the 18th day, the answer seemed to be unfolding right in front of her. The goats were healthy enough to move as one group. Nearly an acre of heavy kudzu had disappeared, and sunlight was reaching sections of old fencing that hadn't been visible in years. For the first time since the county notice arrived, Loretta believed she might actually have something worth documenting. That evening, while moving the temporary fencing again, she noticed the same small group of goats trying to push toward the exact place they had returned to every morning. She still didn't know why they were so determined to reach it, and neither did the audience. but the question lingered in the back of her mind as she finished setting the next paddock. Just as hope began replacing doubt, another certified letter arrived from the county. A second complaint from the neighboring property had triggered a new inspection, and officials concluded the progress wasn't happening quickly enough. The original deadline was cut almost in half, leaving Loretta with only 12 days to prove her recovering herd could accomplish what a professional removal crew normally charged tens of thousands of dollars to do. For the first time since the auction, it wasn't the condition of the goats that worried her most. It was the realization that time itself had become the greatest obstacle. Loretta walked the property at dusk, stopping where the freshly cleared ground gave way to another solid wall of kudzu. For the first time since bringing the herd home, she forced herself to face the numbers instead of the progress. The goats had cleared roughly 4 acres, but 46 still lay ahead of them, and after the county's latest notice, only 12 days remained. However encouraging the recovery of the herd had been, the math refused to cooperate. At their current pace, they simply weren't going to make it. For the first time since inheriting her father's farm, Loretta seriously considered calling the county and asking what happened if she surrendered the property instead of letting a lien swallow it piece by piece. Standing alone at the edge of the paddock, she found herself hearing her father's voice again. Land usually tells you how to save it. Most folks just stop watching too soon. She wanted to believe him. For one quiet moment, though, she wondered if this was the one piece of land even he would never have been able to save. Before she made the call, an old pickup eased into the driveway. Cecil Whitmire climbed out, walked slowly along the fence, watched the goats working through the vines, then looked at the wide paddock without saying a word. After several minutes, he turned to Loretta and asked a single question. "Why are you giving him so much room?" She frowned, unsure what he meant. Cecil pointed toward the herd. "You're letting him choose." That was all he said. He climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving Loretta standing at the fence trying to understand the meaning behind those 5 words. By nightfall, she had an idea. Instead of giving the goats one large paddock, she rebuilt the temporary fencing into narrow grazing strips, forcing the herd to finish one section completely before moving on to the next. The first morning didn't go as planned. Several goats pushed through a loose section of fence and wandered back on a ground they had already cleared, costing her nearly an entire day's progress. Rather than give up, Loretta rebuilt every weak corner before sunrise, driving the posts deeper and tightening every wire she could. The change became obvious within days. With only 9 days remaining, the goats were no longer grazing scattered patches but stripping entire lanes of kudzu before moving forward, and the cleared ground began expanding faster than Loretta could photograph it. For the first time since the county's deadline had been shortened, she allowed herself to believe there might be enough visible progress to convince officials they weren't looking at 60 starving goats anymore. They were looking at the beginning of a solution. The breakthrough came sooner than Loretta expected. As the goats worked their way through the oldest and thickest wall of kudzu, the landscape beyond it began changing in ways she had never imagined. The tangled mass of vines that had dominated the outer edge of the property gradually gave way to a cooler, quieter ravine where the growth became noticeably thinner with every section the herd cleared. For the first time in decades, she could see farther than a few feet into the back of the property, and the deeper she walked, the more one question refused to leave her mind. Why had the kudzu become so overwhelming along the outer edge, only to weaken so dramatically a short distance inside? The answer slowly revealed itself as more sunlight reached the ground. The outer boundary of the property had spent decades fully exposed to the sun, creating ideal conditions for the vines to spread unchecked. Beyond that barrier, however, the land dropped into a shaded ravine where mature trees formed a dense canopy overhead. Without constant sunlight, the kudzu had never grown with the same intensity, allowing the interior to remain surprisingly open while the outer wall continued convincing everyone that the entire back of the farm had been swallowed. As the goats pushed farther into the ravine, another surprise emerged. Thick tree trunks began appearing through the remaining vines, one after another, standing remarkably straight and spaced with a consistency that immediately caught Loretta's attention. They didn't look like random trees that had grown naturally over time. They looked as though someone had planted them long before she was born. She walked among them, studying the deeply furrowed bark and towering canopies, but couldn't identify the species. Whatever they were old, healthy, and far too valuable-looking to ignore. Unsure what she had found, Loretta contacted the county extension office, which arranged for consulting forester Hal Pruitt to visit the property. He spent the better part of an afternoon walking the ravine in near silence, measuring trunk diameters, examining the bark, and repeatedly looking high into the canopy before writing anything in his notebook. Loretta waited patiently, searching his face for some clue, but he refused to rush his conclusion. Only after finishing his measurements did he finally turn toward her. "Loretta," he said quietly, "these aren't ordinary hardwoods. You're standing in one of the finest old black walnut groves I've seen in years." The discovery didn't end there. As more of the property became accessible, Pruitt expanded his survey beyond the first cluster of trees. Every new section the goats cleared revealed another stand, then another, until it became obvious the grove stretched far deeper into the ravine than anyone had imagined. The same steep terrain and dense outer wall of kudzu that had convinced generations of landowners to stay away had quietly protected the interior from loggers, developers, and even curious hunters for decades. Several weeks later, after completing a full inventory, Pruitt returned with the final report. The survey documented more than 90 mature black walnut trees, including at least 14 veneer-quality specimens capable of commanding premium prices in the timber market. Based on a carefully managed selective harvest that would preserve the grove for future generations, his conservative valuation exceeded $1,400,000. Only then did the full picture become clear. Loretta hadn't simply bought 60 starving goats that happened to clear a field of kudzu. Without anyone realizing it, those goats had uncovered one of the most valuable hidden black walnut groves in the county, a discovery that had remained concealed for decades behind a wall of vines almost everyone else had written off as worthless. Word spread through the county far more quickly than Loretta expected. People who had laughed when she bought 60 starving goats for $11 now came to see what those same animals had accomplished, and one by one the people who had doubted her found themselves standing on the very ground they believed would never amount to anything. Delbert Cagle was the first to return. Expecting to find a struggling herd barely hanging on, he instead walked into a pasture filled with healthy goats in strong body condition. 54 of the original 60 had fully recovered, several does were already bred, and young kids had begun appearing among the herd. Delbert stood quietly for a long moment before admitting he had been wrong. Rather than criticizing Loretta's decision, he found himself asking how she had managed to rebuild a herd that had looked beyond saving only a few months earlier. Dr. Renee Okafor visited soon afterward for a final examination. While she had hoped most of the goats would recover, even she was surprised by how completely they had turned around. The improvements in body condition, overall health, and breeding performance convinced her there was something worth documenting. And before leaving, she asked Loretta if she could use the herd as a case study for future livestock education, believing other struggling farmers could learn from what had happened there. The county's final inspection brought the outcome Loretta had been praying for since the certified letter first arrived. The documented grazing records, photographs, and steadily expanding cleared acreage satisfied every requirement of the invasive species ordinance. The lien was officially withdrawn, and instead of discussing penalties, the county officer asked whether she would consider demonstrating her rotational grazing system for other landowners facing kudzu problems of their own. The most meaningful moment came a few days later when Marlene walked with her through the newly uncovered walnut grove. She stopped beneath the towering canopy, looked around at trees neither of them had known were there, and after a long silence simply smiled. Dad would have been proud. Nothing else needed to be said. Before long, Loretta found Cecil Whitmire repairing a fence along the property line and thanked him for the advice that had changed everything. She even tried to pay him, but he gently waved the money away. "Your daddy shared a fence with me for 30 years, he said, looking toward the herd grazing peacefully across the hillside. "Just figured it was my turn to return the favor." It was the closest he ever came to explaining why he had helped. The success of the herd soon grew into something much bigger than anyone had imagined. As word spread, neighboring landowners began asking Loretta to bring her goats onto their own properties to clear heavy kudzu, and what started as 60 unwanted animals slowly became a thriving goatscaping and breeding business with work booked months in advance. At the same time, The newly discovered Black Walnut Grove was placed under a carefully managed forestry plan that protected the woodland while allowing a selective harvest valued at more than $1.4 million over time. The same $11 purchase that everyone had laughed at ultimately became the foundation for two life-changing opportunities, one restoring neglected land across the county, and the other preserving a forgotten grove that had been quietly waiting behind the vines for decades. For more than 20 years, everyone who looked at that property asked exactly the same question. How do we get rid of the kudzu? It was the question neighbors asked whenever they drove past the farm. It was the question the county tried to answer with deadlines and paperwork. Even Loretta had spent years believing the vines were simply another burden her father never had the chance to remove. No one stopped to ask a different question. What has the kudzu been hiding all this time? The answer turned out to be much bigger than a grove of valuable trees. It was a reminder that land doesn't always reveal its worth at first glance. Sometimes the very thing people see as the problem becomes the reason something far more valuable survives long enough to be found. Loretta's goats weren't extraordinary because they cleared kudzu. Goats have been doing that for generations. The difference was that Loretta paid attention after everyone else had stopped. She noticed where they wanted to go, she kept asking why, and she was willing to follow instead of pulling them back. In the end, her father had been right. Land usually tells you how to save it. Most folks just stop watching too soon. Sometimes the greatest opportunities aren't hidden because they're impossible to find. They're hidden because most people decide something is worthless long before they ever discover what lies beyond it. 1 year after buying 60 starving goats for just $11, Loretta's life looked nothing like it had the day she stood in that auction yard wondering whether she'd made a terrible mistake. The same herd nobody wanted had become one of the healthiest breeding herds in the county, helping restore neglected land across 3 counties through the same goatscaping method that had saved her father's farm. Behind the old farmhouse, the forgotten Black Walnut Grove is still standing today, carefully managed so future generations can benefit from what previous generations never knew was there. Every time Loretta walks that shaded ravine, she's reminded that the greatest thing she inherited from her father wasn't 50 acres of land. It was the patience to keep watching when everyone else had already stopped. Imagine your father's land was on the line. You had just $41 left, and 60 starving goats came up for sale for $11. Would you have taken the chance or walked away? Why? If you enjoy stories about forgotten American land, overlooked opportunities, and remarkable discoveries like this one, subscribe. There are still plenty of forgotten American stories waiting to be told.